In 1819, the United States seemed to be in a delicate balance. There were 11 free states where slavery was illegal, and 11 slave states where slavery was allowed. On the surface, this looked like a fair setup, with both sides having equal power in the government. But beneath this calm exterior, things were not as stable as they appeared. The real tension was about how the country would expand. Many Americans believed the United States was destined to grow, stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This idea of expansion would later be called manifest destiny, but even before that term was coined, the drive to gain more land was already a powerful force. By 1819, the United States had grown to 22 states, including Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama. But the country's borders weren't set in stone. In 1818, the Missouri Territory, part of the massive Louisiana Purchase, asked to become a state. The following year, Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, also applied for statehood. This created a serious problem. Adding new states could upset the careful balance between free and slave states. People in the North, especially abolitionists who wanted to end slavery, were concerned that if Missouri became a slave state, it would give the South more power and make it harder to stop slavery from spreading. On the other side, Southerners argued that new states should have the right to choose for themselves whether they wanted slavery, just like the original 13 colonies had done. This sparked a fierce debate in Congress throughout 1819. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, came up with a compromise to calm things down. His idea was that Missouri could enter the Union as a slave state, but at the same time, Maine would join as a free state. This way, the balance of power would stay even. But that wasn't the end of the debate. In 1820, the Senate added another rule. Any new states that were formed north of the 3630 latitude line, which was Missouri's southern border, would be free states. This compromise, later known as the Missouri Compromise, helped maintain peace for a while by setting up a pattern. For every new slave state, a free state would be added too. This system worked for a few more years. Arkansas became a state in 1836, followed by Michigan in 1837 and Florida in 1845. Since Florida was a slave state, most people expected that the next state to join would be a free state to keep things balanced. But when Texas entered the picture, the situation became more complicated. Texas had recently won its independence from Mexico, and many Texans wanted to join the United States. At first, the U.S. government was hesitant because adding Texas as a state would stir up problems. But the growing belief in expansion convinced leaders to move forward, and on December 29, 1845, Texas became part of the Union. However, there was a big problem. Texas wanted to be a slave state, which threatened to upset the delicate balance between North and South. On top of that, Texas claimed large areas of land that Mexico also believed belonged to them, which increased tensions between the two countries. At this time, James K. Polk had just been elected president. Polk was a strong supporter of manifest destiny, and he was determined to acquire more land, especially the disputed territories claimed by both Texas and Mexico. Ignoring Mexico's objections, Polk tried a peaceful approach at first. He sent a diplomat named John Slidell to negotiate with Mexico, offering $30 million to buy California, New Mexico, and the disputed lands along the Texas border. But Mexico was furious at the idea and refused to even meet with Slidell, turning down the offer completely. Polk wasn't ready to give up. Instead of backing down, he decided to provoke a conflict. He sent U.S. troops to the Texas border, fully aware that this would likely lead to a fight. Within a few months, Mexican soldiers attacked the American forces, which was exactly what Polk had been waiting for. With this incident as his justification, Polk declared war on Mexico. As the Mexican-American War unfolded, the argument over the balance between free and slave states continued back in the United States. With the number of free states shrinking, many people in the North became suspicious of Polk's true intentions. They believed that he was using the war as an excuse to expand the number of slave states, which only increased the growing tensions between the North and the South. These tensions would eventually lead to even bigger conflicts in the future. As the Mexican-American War raged on, two men emerged as military leaders destined to become household names: Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. Both gained widespread recognition for their roles in leading American troops deeper into Mexican territory. Their success eventually led to the capture of Mexico City, the heart of the Mexican nation. With the capital taken, Mexico had little choice but to agree to peace. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, was a monumental event that would reshape the future of North America. In exchange for $15 million, Mexico was forced to give up vast swathes of land, including not just California and New Mexico, but parts of modern-day Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Wyoming. This massive territorial gain seemed like a great victory for President Polk, but the new land came with a price. It intensified the ongoing disputes back home. As the United States grew, so did the number of states looking to join the Union. Iowa, Wisconsin, and California all applied for statehood in the years following the war. These new territories, however, raised the thorny issue of slavery once again, leading to the Compromise of 1850. This compromise was a complex package of laws designed to address multiple issues, but the most pressing one was slavery. California, for example, was admitted as a free state, but in order to maintain the balance between free and slave states, it had to send one pro-slavery senator to Congress. The compromise also introduced the idea of popular sovereignty, allowing future states in the newly acquired territories to decide for themselves whether they would allow slavery or not. For a brief period, this approach seemed to work. Minnesota joined the Union as a free state in 1858, followed by Oregon in 1859. However, the peace wouldn't last long. A few years later, Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a new idea that would unravel the Missouri Compromise and spark even more conflict. Douglas suggested applying popular sovereignty to the new Nebraska Territory, which stretched over land that had previously been designated as free territory by the Missouri Compromise. His plan involved splitting the Nebraska Territory into two separate territories, Nebraska and Kansas, and allowing settlers in each one to vote on whether or not to permit slavery. This proposal became the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and it set off a chain reaction. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into Kansas, each hoping to tip the balance in their favor. What followed was a violent period of conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, as clashes between the two sides turned deadly. The situation became so chaotic that Kansas earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas due to the violent struggles between those for and against slavery. Ultimately, Kansas joined the Union as a free state in 1861, just as the nation was on the brink of civil war. But how did things escalate so quickly? The root of the conflict lay in the deep divide between the North and South over slavery. In the North, the economy was becoming more industrialized, and many Northerners began to see slavery as not only unnecessary, but also morally wrong. The North was also influenced by European immigrants from countries where slavery had been abolished, which led to the rise of the abolitionist movement. The South, on the other hand, remained largely agricultural and depended heavily on slave labor. For many Southerners, slavery wasn't just an economic necessity, it was a way of life. The invention of the cotton gin only made this dependence on slavery stronger, as it made cotton farming far more profitable. This division created fear on both sides. The North was worried that if slavery spread to new territories, it would be impossible to stop. Meanwhile, the South feared losing their slaves and their way of life. These concerns were deeply felt, and both sides believed they were justified. However, they were miles apart when it came to finding a solution. Adding another layer of tension was the ongoing debate over federal versus state rights. The Southern states, which would later form the Confederacy, believed in the idea of state sovereignty. They were wary of federal control and preferred to make decisions at the state level, especially when it came to slavery. This issue of state versus federal authority was a major factor in the growing discord, even though it played second fiddle to the slavery debate. Looking back, it's clear that the South might have revolted or caused more trouble earlier if the central issue had been states' rights. Loyalty to individual states was strong in the South, often stronger than loyalty to the country as a whole. This tension over state versus federal authority certainly played a role in the growing divide, but the real fire was fueled by the slavery debate. Several key events added fuel to the fire. One of the most significant was the Fugitive Slave Act, which was part of the Compromise of 1850. This law made it the responsibility of the federal government to capture and return escaped slaves, even if they had made it to free states. It also punished anyone who helped slaves escape. This law outraged Northerners, who saw it as an attack on their own state's rights and personal beliefs. In response, many people in the North began to resist, leading to the rise of the Republican Party, a political group that strongly opposed the expansion of slavery. This growing opposition in the North only deepened the divide, making the conflict between North and South inevitable. The rapid rise of the Republican Party brought a new face to the forefront: Abraham Lincoln. Though Lincoln had served a term in the House of Representatives, it was his run for the Senate in 1858 that truly put him in the national spotlight. Despite losing to Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's debates and speeches during the campaign struck a chord with many in the North. His powerful words against the expansion of slavery earned him popularity in the region, but also made him a target of fierce opposition in the South. The divide between North and South deepened as Lincoln's influence grew, setting the stage for further conflict. Adding to the mounting tension was the violent period known as Bleeding Kansas, which unfolded between 1855 and 1859. Kansas had become a battleground, not just for settlers, but for the future of the nation. As pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces clashed, guerrilla warfare broke out, with settlers from neighboring states crossing into Kansas to influence the vote on whether it would be a free or slave state. Legal loopholes allowed these outsiders to vote, leading to a chaotic and divided government. Violent skirmishes erupted across the territory, with estimates of between 50 to 200 people losing their lives. These bloody years further fueled the drive towards civil war, as both sides became more entrenched in their positions. Tensions reached a new level in 1856 with the infamous incident involving Congressman Charles Sumner. A Republican from the North, Sumner delivered a fiery speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he condemned the expansion of slavery and launched personal attacks on pro-slavery senators. The speech enraged Southerners, and just days later, Preston Brooks, a representative from South Carolina, along with his colleague Lawrence Keitt, confronted Sumner in the Senate chamber. Brooks brutally beat Sumner with a cane, leaving him severely injured. Sumner would spend the next 3 years recovering, but the attack only added fuel to the growing fire between North and South. The situation grew even more volatile with the Dred Scott case, a legal battle that gripped the nation. Dred Scott, a slave, had lived in free states with his owner, and later tried to buy his freedom when he was sold to a new owner, Irene Emerson. When she refused, Scott, along with his wife Harriet, sued for their freedom. They based their case on Missouri laws stating that slaves who had lived in free states were considered free. Initially, the courts ruled in their favor in 1850, granting them freedom. But Irene appealed, and the case was taken to the Missouri Supreme Court, which reversed the decision, re-enslaving the Scotts. Undeterred, Scott took his case to federal court in 1853, and it became known as Dred Scott v. Sanford, after ownership was transferred to John Sanford. The case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, with much anticipation from both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates. In 1857, the court delivered a devastating blow to the abolitionist movement. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be U.S. citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. Although the Scotts were later freed through the intervention of Irene Emerson's new abolitionist husband, the ruling intensified the nation's growing divide and further solidified abolitionists' resolve to end slavery. Around the same time, another fiery figure entered the scene: John Brown, a radical abolitionist. On October 16, 1859, Brown led a group of followers in a daring raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to seize weapons and spark a slave uprising across the South. However, the raid failed, as local militia forces, quickly reinforced by U.S. troops under the command of General Robert E. Lee, surrounded Brown and his men. Many of Brown's followers were killed in the ensuing fight, and Brown himself was captured. Though the raid failed, Brown's boldness and willingness to die for the cause of ending slavery turned him into a martyr for the abolitionist movement, further pushing the nation towards civil war. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the breaking point for the Southern states. Lincoln, a strong anti-slavery figure from the North, was seen as a threat to the Southern way of life. South Carolina wasted no time in reacting to his victory. They quickly convened and decided to secede from the Union. In their declaration, they highlighted the deep divide in the country, famously stating, "A geographical line has been drawn across the Union." This was just the beginning. Within a short time, 10 more Southern states followed suit, joining forces to form the Confederate States of America under the leadership of Jefferson Davis. Lincoln, however, was determined to preserve the Union. He refused to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation and reassured the South that he had no plans to interfere with slavery where it already existed. But the South was facing an uphill battle. The numbers were not in their favor. When they seceded, the Union had a population of 22 million, while the South had only 9 million. The Union also boasted a much larger army, enlisting around 2 million soldiers, while the Confederates could only muster about 900,000. In terms of infrastructure, the North had a huge advantage as well. With roughly 20,000 miles of railroad, twice as much as the South, they could move troops and supplies much more efficiently. Even though the South had talented generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, the North controlled 90% of the country's industrial production, giving them a significant edge in manufacturing war supplies. Despite these challenges, the Confederacy wasn't going to back down easily. The Union, on the other hand, found it difficult to maintain control in the South, especially at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. This fort, the last remaining Union stronghold in the state, was in bad shape. The Union troops there were outnumbered, undersupplied, and under siege by Confederate forces who demanded their surrender. When the Union forces refused, the Confederates opened fire, officially igniting the Civil War. On April 12, 1861, the deadline for Fort Sumter's evacuation passed. Charleston Harbor was surrounded by 6,000 Confederate soldiers, their cannons and mortars ready to fire. At 4:30 a.m., a single mortar from Fort Johnson was launched into the sky, signaling the start of the war. As the first explosions rocked Fort Sumter, people in Charleston rushed to their rooftops to witness history in the making. The Confederates unleashed a relentless barrage of cannon fire on the fort. Despite being outnumbered and low on supplies, the Union defenders fought back with incredible bravery. Their fierce resistance even drew cheers from the Confederate soldiers who admired their determination. The siege continued into the next day, with the fort's roof catching fire. But the Union troops held out until April 13th, when a Confederate cannonball hit the flagpole, breaking it. This blow foreshadowed the end of the battle. After negotiating a surrender, the Union soldiers saluted their battered flag one last time and evacuated, leaving the Confederates victorious in the first battle of the Civil War. The fall of Fort Sumter spurred President Lincoln into decisive action. On April 15th, he called for 75,000 militia volunteers to crush what he described as an illegitimate rebellion. This bold move prompted more Southern states to secede, and Lincoln soon requested an additional 40,000 men for a 3-year service. In response, Confederate President Jefferson Davis called for 100,000 militiamen to serve for 12 months, setting the stage for a long and brutal conflict. At this stage, neither side wanted a prolonged conflict. The South hoped that their bold move at Fort Sumter would force the Union to the negotiating table, knowing full well that they were vastly outnumbered. Meanwhile, the North was wrestling with its own internal issues. President Lincoln faced skepticism from his cabinet and military commanders, many of whom doubted his leadership. To make matters worse, some of his top generals were either old, in poor health, or simply ineffective, which made it challenging to execute a cohesive strategy. Despite these hurdles, a plan was forming. The Union's overall strategy, famously known as the Anaconda Plan, was conceived by Lieutenant General Winfield Scott. His idea was to suffocate the Confederacy by defending Washington, blockading the South's Atlantic and Gulf coasts, and launching a coordinated land and sea offensive along the Mississippi River. The goal was to split the Confederacy in half, cutting off their resources and communication. Although not fully implemented, by late May, Union forces had already crossed the Potomac and secured Arlington Heights. This marked the beginning of a series of small skirmishes that would eventually lead to the first significant battle in Virginia at Big Bethel in early June. On June 10, 1861, Union and Confederate forces met in the small village of Big Bethel. The Union's aim was to establish a defensive buffer around Fort Monroe, one of their last strongholds in the region. However, things didn't go as planned. The Union's efforts failed, resulting in another Confederate victory, which further shifted the war's momentum in favor of the South. Lincoln's military leadership was proving to be lackluster, while the Confederates were demonstrating strong, decisive command on the battlefield. In a rare success for the Union, the Wheeling Conventions led to the northwestern counties of Virginia breaking away to form West Virginia, which chose to side with the North. This gave the Union a much-needed boost, and they turned their focus to their primary objective, capturing Richmond, the Confederate capital, and ending the war swiftly. General Irvin McDowell led an army of 35,000, the largest force yet assembled in North America, toward this goal. Enthusiastic civilians followed the troops, convinced that a quick and easy victory was within reach, one that would crush the Confederacy and reunite the nation. But what awaited them would be far from the swift triumph they imagined. It was the Battle of Bull Run. McDowell's army was largely made up of fresh recruits, most of whom had answered Lincoln's call to arms after the fall of Fort Sumter. These soldiers had little experience and even less understanding of what they were about to face. McDowell's plan was to capture a key railroad junction at Manassas, near a creek called Bull Run, where Confederate forces were entrenched, ready to defend their territory. His strategy was to attack the Confederate front and right flank with 3 columns, forcing them to abandon the junction and retreat. As McDowell's troops advanced, Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard urgently requested reinforcements from Richmond. Help was on the way, led by General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah. However, Johnston's arrival was delayed by Union Major General Robert Patterson, who was tasked with keeping Johnston occupied with his 18,000-strong force to prevent him from reaching Bull Run. Meanwhile, McDowell's army was closing in on Beauregard's defenses. McDowell sent around 5,000 men under Brigadier General Theodore Runyon to secure the rear, while another division under Brigadier General Daniel Tyler was ordered to strike the Confederate right flank. This maneuver led to a small but intense clash at Blackburn's Ford, where Tyler's troops encountered fierce resistance and were eventually pushed back by the determined Confederate defenders. Patterson's Union forces were struggling. Despite his claims of holding Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's troops at Winchester, Johnston managed to outmaneuver him, slipping past using a cavalry screen. Now, Johnston was headed toward Bull Run, and this development posed a serious threat to General Irvin McDowell, who had been banking on his numerical advantage over the Confederates. The battle commenced on July 21, 1861. McDowell aimed for a surprise attack by sending 2 divisions from Centerville toward Sudley Springs to outflank the Confederate left, while another division acted as a diversion at Stone Bridge. It was a solid plan on paper, but the inexperience of Union troops, coupled with poor execution, led to chaos. Colonel Nathan Evans, defending the bridge, quickly saw through the diversion and shifted his main force to Matthews Hill to confront the true Union attack. Despite being outnumbered, Evans managed to slow down the Union advance. However, as reinforcements arrived, the Confederate defense began to crumble under increasing Union pressure. That's when General Barnard B. rallied his wavering troops with the now famous cry, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." rally behind the Virginians. As Confederate leaders Johnston and Beauregard arrived at Henry House Hill, the Union troops were in trouble. The two sides clashed fiercely at Henry House Hill. After a brief pause, the battle resumed, with the Confederates regaining their footing. They managed to capture Union artillery and steadily pushed the Northern troops off the hill. By 4 p.m., the Confederates had secured a victory. As the Union forces lost their ground, what began as an organized retreat quickly descended into chaos. Confederate forces pursued aggressively, turning a manageable defeat into a full-blown rout. While some Union soldiers made it back to Washington by the next day, the campaign had been a catastrophic failure. The loss damaged President Lincoln's reputation, and his wartime decisions began to look increasingly heavy-handed. With tensions rising, Lincoln took drastic measures to suppress dissent. His administration began censoring mail, telegraphs, and newspapers, and those who expressed support for the Confederacy faced arrest. Even Democratic Congressman Clement L. Vallandigham was jailed for opposing the war. The government went as far as shutting down the offices of the dissenting Sunday Chronicle. These actions fueled talk of impeachment, but Lincoln shored up his defenses around Washington, keeping his critics at bay. While pressure from abolitionists was mounting, Lincoln remained focused on restoring the Union rather than addressing the question of emancipation. He signed the Confiscation Act of 1861, allowing the government to seize property, including enslaved people, from those rebelling against the Union. These enslaved people were classified as contraband and used as laborers for Union infrastructure, not yet a step toward full emancipation, but a critical move nonetheless. Just 4 days after the Confiscation Act was passed, the war's momentum shifted again. In Missouri, Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon was preparing to face Confederate Generals Ben McCulloch and Sterling Price in Springfield. This clash would mark the Battle of Wilson's Creek, the first major battle west of the Mississippi River. Ironically, both sides were planning to ambush each other, completely unaware of the other's strategy. Lyon's plan involved sending 1,200 men under Colonel Franz Sigel to circle around the Confederate right flank while the main force attacked from the north. But a sudden downpour and a stroke of luck caused McCulloch to abandon his own ambush, giving the Union an unexpected advantage on August 10th. The Confederate forces were caught off guard by the Union's surprise attack. Lyon's troops pushed forward quickly, reaching what would later be called Bloody Hill. However, the Pulaski, Arkansas battery soon halted their advance. As Lyon's men tried to press forward, General Price regrouped his forces and moved to Bloody Hill, where a brutal 6-hour battle unfolded. Though the Union had started with an advantage, the tide began to turn in favor of the Confederates as the bloody fight dragged on. Meanwhile, Confederate forces clashed with Union troops at Sharp Farm, where McCulloch's counterattack crushed Sigel's earlier successful flanking maneuver, forcing Sigel to retreat. Lyon's situation was also deteriorating. Already injured, he was eventually killed during the battle, leaving command to Major Samuel Sturgis. Sturgis did his best, but with ammunition running low and defeat looming, the Union forces were forced to retreat to Springfield before noon. Just a few weeks after the defeat at Wilson's Creek, the Union scored a morale-boosting victory at sea. Confederate raiders had been targeting the Carolina coast, prompting a swift Union response. They captured the unfinished Fort Clark and Fort Hatteras after a naval bombardment. The Confederate defenders at Fort Clark fled to Fort Hatteras, which soon surrendered. Though this was a win for the North, it was overshadowed by more bad news as the Confederates prepared to take Lexington, Missouri. General Price and his 15,000 troops reached Lexington on September 11, 1861. The fighting began the next day as Union forces tried to hold off the Confederate advance, but Price's men quickly cornered the Union defenders in their fortifications. Although the Confederates couldn't force an immediate surrender, they pinned down the Union forces. After a 2-hour artillery duel and supply delays, Price chose to wait, confident that patience will give us what we want. By September 18th, Price was ready to strike. Despite strong Union artillery, the Confederates pressed forward, eventually bottling up the defenders again. After 9 hours of cannon fire and the capture of the Anderson House, used as a Union hospital, the city fell to the South. As dissatisfaction with Lincoln's leadership grew, another setback hit the Union in October. A poorly planned reconnaissance mission across the Potomac led to a disastrous attack at Ball's Bluff, commanded by Colonel Edward Baker, a close friend of Lincoln. The attack was a calamity. Due to poor planning, Baker was killed and his troops were trapped, many of them either fleeing, being killed, or jumping to their deaths. Those who escaped drowned in the icy river. The generals involved, Charles Stone and George McClellan, faced harsh criticism. Stone was even charged with treason. McClellan, though somewhat distanced from the disaster, was promoted to General-in-Chief of all Union armies, despite his strained relationship with Lincoln. The American Civil War ended in the spring of 1865, after 4 brutal years of fighting between the Union, North, and the Confederacy, South. The turning point came with a series of significant Union victories in 1864 and 1865, including General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, which devastated the South's infrastructure, and General Ulysses S. Grant's relentless pursuit of Confederate forces in Virginia. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army, exhausted and outnumbered, was forced to abandon the Confederate capital of Richmond. Lee eventually surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Court House in Virginia on April 9, 1865. This surrender effectively marked the end of the war, as remaining Confederate forces soon followed suit. The Union's victory preserved the United States as one nation and led to the abolition of slavery. Make sure to subscribe, drop a comment below, and let us know which historical event or figure you're curious about next. Your feedback helps shape our content, and we love to hear from you.